My name's Nick Redfern, official title, author/researcher. I guess I'm one of these people who's never actually seen a UFO or any sort of paranormal phenomena or anything like that. But how I got involved in the subject is my father was in the British Royal Air Force and worked on radar. He was a radar mechanic, and he was involved in several UFO incidents. He was stationed at a base on the east coast of England. And on several occasions in the early hours of the morning, strange objects were tracked on the radar screens. And this was the height of the Cold War still. And so the first thought was, it's got to be the Russians launching some sort of sneak attack or, spy planes, that kind of thing. So fighters were sent up to try and intercept them. All they could report seeing were these strange, very brightly lit balls of light that seemed to be under some sort of intelligent control. As the planes would close in on them, the objects would sort of flit around behind them, playing kind of like a game of cat and mouse with the air crews. And this went on for like 3 or 4 hours on the first night, and the same on the second night and on the third night. And that was when it totally finished. There was no more repeat experiences. But everybody involved, from the ground crew to the radar operators to the radar mechanics like my father and the pilots, they were all briefed and told, you won't talk about this. You've signed what was called the British government's Official Secrets Act. And my dad didn't talk about it until like decades later. And he told me when I was like 12, 13, something like that. And that's what really got me interested in the subject. Not because it was just my own father, but because he was somebody trained in the military on radar. That was his official job. And so when you speak to someone who knows about the phenomenon, who's in the military, working on radar, that sort of really opened my eyes up to, the idea of, wow, UFOs are real and the military knows about it. In terms of investigations that I've personally done, when I left school, I began working on a music magazine back in England called Zero. And that got me into journalism. It was sort of doing interviews with bands and going to concerts and writing reviews, that sort of thing. And over time, I thought, well, why not try and combine the background in journalism with the interest that I got in UFOs and strange phenomena. And so that's what I decided to do. And of course, when you start to write about things and people contact you with investigations and stories and that kind of thing. And so that really opened me up to starting to do investigations. And where I grew up, it was an area of central England, which was close to a heavily forested place called the Cannock Chase. And there have been a lot of reports from there of a particular type of UFO that's become known as the Black Triangle. And they're sort of very large, black, triangular-shaped vehicles, which kind of look vaguely like a sort of a next-generation stealth-type aircraft. So there's a lot of controversy as to what they actually are. But that was sort of the very first investigation I ever did, was of a man and his son who'd seen in the mid-1980s one of these large flying triangles hovering over the Cannock Chase woods. And it was literally hovering in total silence. And it was somewhere in the region of about 30 to 40 feet long, maybe like about 15 feet wide. So like a regular triangle shape. And they came across as very, very credible. They didn't elaborate or speculate. They just said, well, this is what we saw. This is what it looked like. It clearly wasn't a helicopter. There was no sound, no rotor blades. And, the average aircraft doesn't hover in silence 50 feet above, an area of forest land. And they said it suddenly shot away at a very high speed. And I've sort of never really forgotten that case because it demonstrated, again, not just the credibility of the witness, but also the fact that how to do an interview with someone, how to collect data, how to analyze it. And then I started sort of looking for corroborative material from other witnesses. Was there anybody else in the area? It turned out that they'd actually contacted the local police, who, interestingly enough, came out within minutes of them getting home to interview them about what they'd seen. And a report was filed with the Ministry of Defence, and officially they said, well, there was no threat to national security. It wasn't anything we were flying. Thank you very much, goodbye. And that was the end of it. So they were sort of puzzled that the whole thing was left to drop. But that was, as I said, the first case that I really got involved in terms of an investigation. One of the cases that really sort of spurred me on to investigate UFO phenomena and the way in which the subject is hidden from us was a 1964 case not too far from where I grew up, which you might call like a British Roswell, where for years there have been rumours about this object crashing in an area of woodland near a little English town called Penkridge in February 1964, or possibly March 64. And a number of people have come forward talking about seeing military and police cordons on the road, keeping people away from the area, and seeing this strange sort of delta-shaped object in the field, which was reportedly being loaded onto like a military transporter truck. And over the years, I've probably spoken to some of the 15 or 16 people who had some sort of knowledge of this case. And interestingly enough, the first fragments of the story surfaced in the US from a retired US Air Force intelligence officer named Leonard Stringfield, who, after his retirement, because he had his own UFO experience, he dedicated his life to investigating UFOs. And he was given this story by a source in the US Navy who talked about how they were tracking this object, and it reportedly sort of broke into several pieces in the sky, and reportedly several of these pieces came down in England near this town of Penkridge, and another portion slammed into the ground somewhere in Germany. In other words, it was like a satellite re-entering the atmosphere, in that respect at least, that parallel. And I looked into this case extensively and, as I said, tracked down a number of witnesses. What was very weird was that one of the witnesses, a man named Harold South, I interviewed him and arranged to do the interview like a couple of days before. When I got to the house, he was very sort of reticent to talk, and he said he'd had this weird phone call from the Ministry of Defence warning him not to talk about the case. So this sort of made me wonder, well, you know, was my phone monitored? Was his phone monitored? And it kind of sounded a bit paranoid. And so I said, well, can I dial 1471? 1471 in England is a number where if you dial it, it gives you the last incoming number, unless it's been blocked by the caller. Turns out the number wasn't blocked. And we were able to trace the call back to a place called the Ministry of Defence Guards Service. So we really did get a call from the Ministry of Defence just before I went to interview him. And that was like a really weird and strange experience. And that kind of spurred me on to get the truth. That was sort of 20 years ago. And when you find yourself plunged into something that sounds straight out of the X-Files, it does sort of galvanise you and spur you on to look for the answers. And that's what I've tried to do ever since. One of the things I always say to people, if you've seen a UFO, if you had an alien encounter, an abduction experience, don't be frightened to share the information or ask questions and try and find guidance or help. Because in today's world, you know, there are a lot of people who are interested in this subject, and that includes like medical and scientific professionals. And, you know, don't feel frightened or victimized that you shouldn't talk about this. If you do talk about it, you're actually very good company, because we have reports of UFOs from astronauts, from pilots, from professional scientists. So in other words, don't feel you're crazy. Don't feel you're going to be ostracized or laughed at. I always tell people to sort of stand up, and if you had a case, talk about it, because I always tell people the most important people in the subject are the witnesses, because without the witnesses, we've got no information to go on. So we're reliant on people telling us about what they've seen. So in that sense, if you've seen something, get the story out there. In terms of the sort of things I work on and what I've been working on recently, I like to sort of mix things up a little bit. I'm interested in several subjects, one being the subject of UFOs and the other one being cryptozoology, which is unknown animals like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and things like that. And so right now I've got two very different books out, which have come out literally sort of within a few weeks of each other. The first one was called Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. And this is a study of mysterious and suspicious deaths within the UFO field. researchers who've died under strange circumstances, pilots chasing UFOs where the planes just vanished or crashed and the pilots were killed, and also researchers who may have got a little bit too close to the truth. And the other one, which I've done with a fellow researcher and friend, Brad Steiger, very well-known author, we co-wrote a book called The Zombie Book, which is like an A to Z of everything to do with zombies. So I sort of really cover a lot of different bases, you know, but I like to do that so you don't just get burned out writing about one particular subject.